And, if I can pass it to you, Shane.
Alrighty.
Go ahead, kick off our steerco meeting.
That's right. And just to say, incredibly, we went through pretty much everything we wanted to do in the board meeting.
Yeah.
So, yes, fantastic. Okay, Steering Outreach Committee meeting. This is the first time we have our steering committee. We're, in this meeting, basically combining our steering and outreach committee inaugural meeting. The steering committee has a bunch of people who can vote. So the steering committee has our members who can vote, the work team leads, and our community representative. The purpose of the steering committee is to essentially lock down a solid recommendation for the board for how we move forward. In this steering committee meeting, we're going to lock down 3 things. 1, our training requirement. 2, our organization requirement. And 3, the terminology we use. Ideally, we've already discussed this in the work teams, so we should have minimal discussion of the minutiae of this stuff. It should be a case where we can look at it and say, we're voting yay or nay in this direction. And that'll go to the governing board for the next meeting to formally ratify. Important point, I have no power at all in the steering committee. So the steering committee actually has a chair, and that's Miriam. She's on the line. And she's going to be responsible for mediating the fights around the language. I've got the slides. Miriam, I don't know if you've had a chance to review the slides, or if you'd like me to run through them with people and then hand over to you. It's your ball game, so how do you want to run it? Okay. Alrighty, that's perfect. And by the way, everyone, Miriam's dialing in from her vacation at an awkward time, so it's a big, big sacrifice.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thanks.
Okay, so I already explained this in brief. We've got a formal description of our purpose and participants. Please note that the steering and outreach committees are formally slightly different. So the steering committee is, as I said, governing board votes plus work team chair votes and 1 elected community rep. The outreach committee is just the board. As you can guess from the names, the point of the steering committee is to steer our spec. The outreach committee is talking about how we communicate to the outside world. How do we build that? Are there any questions about the purpose and participants of this committee? No.
I would say it's not just a spec, right? It's going to
Right.
be spec, conformance, it's a steering, for, the
Certifications.
and certifications, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Essentially steering the project.
Yep.
And so the concept of OpenChain was always that we have the spec at the heart and everything supports that. And that's something we probably need to be cognizant of in the future because, for instance, curriculum is enormously popular, not only in OpenChain, but outside. So, it would be easy for us to get distracted with, let's say, curriculum development, but we need to keep rebasing on the fact that we're building a standard. Now, if there are no further questions, and I'll just pause to see if there's any question, we'll move on to the next slide.
I'll just, maybe I see maybe potentially a little more looser. The spec is clearly a core deliverable of the project. Curriculum is another deliverable. Yes, it does support the spec, and that's a good thing, and that was largely probably why it was developed. But I would imagine, OpenChain has a broader mission. The spec is clearly a part of that. It serves the mission. But I just, I think I try to keep that in my own head that the spec is just a deliverable. And there should be encouragement for all. And you've been generating lots of case studies that may not necessarily, be directly applicable.
Right.
Always. So I don't know if that makes sense, making that distinction, as opposed to everything serving a spec.
It's a good point.
It's the only. I don't know how other people feel about that.
How about we do a vote? First vote. Why not? Okay. So, shall we regard the spec as a deliverable? Along with curriculum being a deliverable and so on? or should the project only be spec? All in favor of deliverable? I don't have a vote, so I. Yes.
Okay.
Do you want to basically do it verbally so that Mary can hear on the phone?
Actually, what's the implications of this?
I think it just lets the project have a broader mission to do lots of stuff and not necessarily be tied to the spec. So compliance, I think it's open source compliance and all the supporting things around compliance. It's just the spec is a great deliverable towards that mission. The alternative is to say, well, everything has to serve the spec, and then we have to think about every deliverable we produce. Does it serve the spec? That's the alternative way of looking at it. Well, maybe that's worth asking. Let's step back. What's the mission of the project? Let's ask the bigger question.
So yeah, this strikes me as a pretty significant question to.
I'm more of a clarifying. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I didn't see it as an expansion of charter, so to speak. You know, can you actually say? Because I thought I heard something different.
Okay. So, well, let me ask this simple question. What is the main objective of the project? The mission.
So first sentence of the paragraph, OpenChain Project builds trust in open source by making open source license compliance simpler and more consistent.
Right. So there's lots of things we can do towards that mission. The spec is clearly a critical tool for that mission. But someone might, like for example, well, the spec might also might generalize. We might have other specs. So for example, we might have a spec to promote open source. Well, actually, this is supposed to be compliance only. Adoption of open source with respect to compliance. So that we're bounded by that. But I'd like to think over time, there's so many things around use of open source, such as security vulnerabilities, we might come up with an additional spec over time. But that might be in violation of this mission. The question really simply is this. Is the spec the core driver and deliverable and everything serves it? Or do you expect other things to come out to serve that mission? That's the question.
And that's what I thought I heard. So, so to me, the spec is the big thing that we have all gathered together to deliver, and then the ecosystem around compliance, is sort of focused around, how well we craft that spec and how well it serves that ecosystem. So, and that's been to me the area where we have actually shown traction and success, and now as to whether or not there's other things consistent with that mission that we haven't thought of yet to also do. One example was the onboarding team. We didn't realize that we really needed to sort of make that usable to people, so we additional tasks to it. There might be, to me, other things that we haven't thought of, but would be complementary to this core mission of creating this project ecosystem of compliance.
So there's two different things. The spec is kind of this blessing or certification you get on top for your program. Then there's all these best practices and different ways of implementing a program. So I've seen documents come from the OSDL and other stuff that may, and if something comes to us, we should ask, well, does it serve the spec? If not, we should be very focused, maniacally focused, and reject things then. Because I get confused sometimes. I see a lot of things happening, and I'm trying to understand what's the relevance to the mission. That's it. And I keep my head focused on the spec because I participate in the spec.
That's a good point. I mean, curriculum especially, I describe it now as a library because it's so many different pieces of information contributed.
And what happens if something comes into that and it's not as relevant to the spec?
Right.
Should we reject it? In the broader mission, we wouldn't. No, I'm done. I think I've done too much. So the way the education in the so keep in mind that as this spec is evolving, and we'll see how the outcome of this meeting is, we're going to probably change the way we deal with training, and it will actually almost diminish the spec a little bit. I'm sorry, the curriculum relevant to the spec, and it could be a really valuable asset. Again, let's make this clear. The spec allows anybody to build any kind of program they want. We don't want to be too prescriptive. But we can be also delivering all kinds of things and tell people, well, this is one way to build a program. This is yet another way to build a program. This is yet another way to build a program. And I want to keep those two things separate as much as we can. That's all. And those are all valuable to this mission.
I guess my biggest concern would be, I think the curriculum, if you did follow through on, didn't meet the spec, would be my concern. You know, I think that anything that the curriculum would need to be passed through the filter.
And that could be the objective of the commission. I mean, I think people can vote on that. I think this committee can vote on that. Does this curriculum support that?
Right.
It could be an independent thing. And yes, I think that would be.
Right.
But is there value in keeping it as a separate deliverable? That's, I guess, the question that's being asked. Maybe there's not. Maybe I'll stop here. I don't see anybody really seeing a value in separating them, so I'll pull back and we'll just continue.
I think when you have something more concrete, I think you're interested in the security aspect of things. And,
One thing that could happen. Yeah. I want to modularize what OpenChain does as a project. Because I keep getting that mixed messaging, and I want to be very clear to people. And now, if we do this, the spec will drive pretty much every deliverable that we produce, we have to have a way of measuring it and doing that. We don't have a formal way of saying, oh, we're accepting this deliverable from the OSDL. Is it consistent with the spec?
Maybe you make a distinction between these are things that if you applied them, you're going to meet the spec, and then these are things that are just nice to have or good information to have. It could be useful for you.
I think some of the conversations we've had offline has been clearly one of the primary goals of OpenChain is to ensure that the conformance artifacts that come out of an open source project are reasonably good. But then there's the other supporting activities and materials like training and best practice and things like that actually might not be directly tied to a conformance artifact, but probably are important for bolstering the community. So if I'm hearing you right, I think there's a question of, what are we driving at? What is core and what is the supporting material? I don't want to say optional, that's not the right word, but more informational level versus what is the core that the group is doing. I think that's what
I wanted some guiding principles, so we all can be focused and marching together.
Yeah.
And let's not invest any more time on this because then we can become very scattered. And if we want to say, if you tell me that the spec will drive everything, I'm going to look how consistent is that, and I'll say we should stop putting energy into that because it's not consistent with what we believe we're marching to.
Right.
It's all marching together. It's a common problem that challenges any development group or any initiative. That's all. I think we can move on. I think there's no real change, so we'll just keep going, and the assumption is that spec is a driving factor.
we can bring it back.
Yeah.
We see a sort of a dissipation of our energies, in places that don't seem aligned. Then we should certainly bring that back and have a conversation about scope and charter, those things. So, thank you.
So our formal agenda is training requirement, organization definition, and the use of the term open source. The first two are items that we kept ricocheting around on our work teams, and one of the key purposes of the steering committee is to catch the ricochets and put a recommendation on them. The use of the term open source is housekeeping. This is something that came up recently, and we just want to formally go through the steering committee to put a stamp on it, a recommendation for the governing board. Let's dive right in. The training requirement. So Mark covered this in a couple of calls already. If anyone has specific questions about it and they missed the calls, we can dig into it. But the big picture is that the training requirement, which explicitly asked for software staff to be trained and a certain percentage of software staff to be trained has been found to be a good fit for some organizations, but not for others. So in response to this, Mark drafted a concept based around language that he found in areas like ISO, which would try to capture the goal, which is to make sure the right people are trained, while not being too prescriptive to allow for a multitude of organizations to choose who are the right people. The training requirement, he's got competence and awareness placed into it, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically starting big, and we narrow it down as we need to based on
We reluctantly narrow down.
reluctantly narrow down.
We do it with great care, is probably the better way of saying that. If you're going to narrow it, then do it, but make sure it really makes a lot of sense.
And just for everyone's reference, this is essentially the concept we'll be looking at OpenChain Spec 2.0, the spec that we move into formal standardization with. We're not in a super hurry to get this done. What we're looking for is a direction that we can build on and make sure it fits. So this is the first item that requires a recommendation vote from the steering committee. The recommendation vote is yes, we proceed in this direction for Spec 2.0, and we go around to a lot of stakeholders and make sure it fits, and reluctantly narrow, as Mark put it, going ahead. So first of all, does anyone have specific questions about this? If you missed the calls or you have been sitting on a question.
I might characterize, the reluctantly narrow to maybe necessarily narrow. I mean, there's
Yeah, I think it's a better way of talking about it.
okay. But, yeah, I think this makes sense. We talked about it in some work games, but certainly we'll get some sense from
It's just a direction.
Right.
it. First, sorry, this one, just.
I think it's a fair comment. I think in the world from which we were influenced by is the ISO 9001. They do have auditors, by the way. And when you have an auditor, they tend to give you a little bit more back on that front. And the very fact that we do right now, conformance, it makes it more difficult because and less credible as a spec. But that's the question we have to ask ourselves then. What's that minimum amount we absolutely should require? And then, is it necessary? Is it absolutely necessary? And go ahead.
I'm just reminded of something Sammy brought up at the meeting. And Sammy, you mentioned about the useful concept of documents the journey to conformance. And we're already working ahead. We're going to do with, ARM, Wind River, and Toyota, the journey to conformance in terms of actually becoming conformant. Would it be useful if, as part of that series, we had essentially the journey to conformance showing different ways to meet the training requirement, to try to quantify it for organizations? We got nodding heads here.
Well, I mean, I definitely think that's an important part of that exercise you asked would be, how do we do the training and offer as much as we can? I can tell you right now, just as an anecdotal thing, we actually have a test, and we've chosen this special testing platform to deliver it, and all our engineers have to pass the test. We don't even require them to take training. There is a training. There is an hour and 20-minute training, and they don't have to take that, but they all have to take the test, and they have to take the test every 24 months. For example, that's an anecdotal that I would offer up in that, to that end.
And how close is that training material to the stuff where the ELF makes available in terms on the Appliance Basics for Developers course? How close is your material to that?
I have to look at it. It's been around for 3+ years.
Okay.
That training, and we are reviving it. I won't go into great detail, but we're going to give a new at the end of Q4. But I'd have to look at that.
Let's talk that more offline. But what I'm wondering is, ELF basically provides a free training. It's on a certificate program. It might be an option that there's a way of tracking that could potentially get introduced. I don't know. But that potentially is a free channel for people to take a basic set of training for the developers.
So, yeah, to the extent training works for folks, I think to the extent training is sort of
And
one
as a
way
test,
to
you can
approach,
test out of it too.
But having flexibility towards meeting this requirement is, I think the thing that we're asking.
I just think we need an option that's available to people without
Yeah.
cost, and I think that the LF option that's there today already could just be adjusted a bit,
Yeah,
and might be a way.
that's a great, actually, Bob, before you go, this gentleman's been waiting to say something.
Yeah.
Oh, no, it's not super important. I was just, and it's a digression from what we're talking about right now. I was just, how do I define, for 1.2 awareness, how do I define the person's doing work? Is that like the entire organization? Just
No, the program
okay.
at the moment.
And from kind of a standards conformance point of view, this is an outline that you either through self-certification or via an auditor would actually build out what that means for your particular circumstances and organization.
I like that one.
So to the more general question, as we did our conformance, we created evidence according to the spec, and we documented that. If this was the direction we went in, we'd look at each of these things and make sure we had some kind of evidence to back it up, to show someone. And particularly, we're thinking about if one of our customers audits us, and I give them the spec. I do expect to be in a meeting where they'll have me hunt down information. I expect to deliver that, so it's very complementary to the exercise.
So is there a situation where somebody who's compliant with 85% won't actually pass this?
You send them a survey that says, do you comply? But
So I think your point is, if someone had been conforming with the older spec, right?
Right.
I believe that this would be met.
Yeah. I think
Because someone chose to keep the old method that was used, and they continued on with that method, and they would be measuring the competency, right? And they're retaining documentation. So it would be consistent with this.
Right. Yeah, what my read is that anyone who met the current spec would meet this.
Yeah.
And there should be no road bump in it. We're just looking at a question of product market fit, because for the organizations that are conformant, nice fit. It's that we're finding organizations that want to conform that say the software staff are not the inflection point for us.
The big challenge what we currently have is we have software staff, and it's too broadly defined, and we're assuming there's one training for all of those guys, where the feedback we've gotten is, well, we design our program where we have these different roles and more narrow roles, and we don't want everybody to have that one training, but we want to break it up and they're now responsible under this new approach to define the different roles, define kind of what competence is, and how you measure that competence. So it's in some sense, a little more work, but it gives you more freedom. And you don't have this everybody. You can have more. I can tell you right now, I'm going to alter my training because we have product managers, we have program managers, and we have developers. Those are 3 different roles in our program. The developers are going to get a more comprehensive training, probably along the lines of what Kate's referring to, and our product marketing guys are going to get the higher level training.
I guess I'm trying to dig into this language where you're saying these persons are competent. That's signifying to me that it's 100% of these persons that you've identified in this role.
I think that's a good observation because
So I think you're raising really interesting points. I think one advantage we have with this language that's being discussed now is that we really are standing on the shoulders of giants. This is an approach that's been widely deployed through ISO 9001, through thousands of companies and probably hundreds of auditing organizations and certification entities. So it's intentionally vague at this level, but it's been applied in so many different ways, anything from software development organizations to manufacturing to you name it, that it provides, I think, a good balance between flexibility and prescription to get a quality result. And so we are not inventing new approaches or paths here.
Now, having said that, I totally agree with that, but again, to Sammy's point, we might come to this. What's different about us in ISO is they're really broad in the organizations. They go from software to hardware widgets, and they have to even be broader.
Yeah.
Where the reality is, we know from compliance, there are certain things we just expect to be there, and we can do that.
Yeah.
And one of those things is a bill of materials, which we do that in the spec, right? And I think there are going to be, we have to be careful in identifying those things. That's the caution. And I think, Sammy, I think you have to continue to have this discussion and point out along the way what's absolutely necessary you believe that we should have, and potentially call that, the acceptable prescription piece. So the other thing I want to point out is roles and responsibilities is in this next section of the spec. We haven't tackled that, but I'm starting to look at that, and Nathan and I'm also pointing me in that direction to point out that we're going to have a certain set of roles that are going to be defined. We're going to have, we currently do define certain roles, an external liaison. Maybe that will go away, maybe, but there will be some roles that we might want to be more, requiring of the spec, and I don't want to go there today. But this would be
Now, we're running quite tight on time, and I know Sammy's going to drop off. So what I'd like to do is propose that we vote to move forward with this training approach and assess market fit with adjacent work on the roles and responsibilities to make sure that everything aligns. So I'd like to propose that we move forward with this approach to assess the market fit with adjacent work on roles and responsibilities. So what I'd like to do is to have everyone in favor say aye.
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 And double check, does anyone disagree? Any nay? Okay, does anyone abstain? Oh, nay, one person. Okay, so I understand we have A from Sammy and Miriam, is that right? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I have made a note of this vote, and we're going to move forward by majority on this, but it should be noted by all participants that this isn't set in stone. This is a recommendation, and we're going to see how that works in practice with our stakeholders. So, for the
Just a point of order, is it majority that's going to be working for this committee, or is it, has that been written down anywhere?
It's not formally defined how that would work, so I was going to proceed with the same assumption as we have with the governing board voting process.
Just probably should talk.
Yes, we probably should. So we'll put that down as something where, let's vote on it. All in favor of majority voting. I've done committees before.
I think you should do it, yeah.
Yeah, we can double check that everyone's comfortable with that. But just as a note on that, the purpose of the steering committee is to move forward with recommendations, and that inherently includes a situation where some people will not agree. We're not going to ignore nays, but we need to kind of set path and then see if that path works or not.
Yeah, and I see that point, the things that are resolved in, on the work teams probably don't always have, won't come to steering committee, right? So, we deal with here, issues that require a decision that, maybe it's been harder to get consensus on, so it's, probably won't be uncommon. I've been very curious though, in coming back with the recommendation, as we get more feedback, to understand Miriam's point a little bit better. I understand Sammy's point, and I don't want to also miss Alan's point, which is somehow we need to memorialize the fact that nowhere here are we intending to cause someone who's conformant with the prior, articulation to become non-compliant. So somehow it needs to be, understood there.
I want to reinforce that and encourage Miriam and Sammy to be devil's advocate as we go forward.
Right.
Because we need that, because that's the intent. Start general, and if you think there's absolutely something that should be in there, we can have that discussion, and we should.
And that's such a good point. I mean, what we've got now is a direction of analysis, and that's a clear direction. But, we need to kick the tires.
Yeah.
Okay, second item for direction, organization scope. This is something where Mark again went to ISO and had a look at how we define organization scope. And it basically seems, Mark, if I'm mischaracterizing this, please let me know, but it looks like we can immediately learn a lot from ISO 9001 about how we deal with the organization. And basically, we're halfway there with the current spec. And if we adopt the second 2 points or similar, we just match exactly what ISO does. So essentially the 2 points that we don't have are not to prescribe the scope that, in our case, the spec governs, and the organization is required to define document scope.
And notably, they're not confined to legal entity definitions.
Right. Which is very useful for us. As we've mentioned in previous meetings, companies like Hitachi have hundreds and hundreds of legal entities. Yeah. So being too prescriptive immediately hits a roadblock.
I mean, someone can't misrepresent also how they label a product, meaning it's important that it has to be consistent with their scope. So I think we have to make sure that the spec is worded that makes sure that they define their scope and they can't misrepresent it according to that definition.
Yes.
And Gary pointed this out. So, go ahead.
Just to be clear, we're prescribed, for our purposes, we're prescribing it as the program, and that's the issue, because we're prescribing it as program. And
Right.
so the proposal would be to remove that reference to program?
No, actually, it has always been program. The question is, does a program apply to the whole legal entity? Or can someone choose to do just a division of their entity? So the one thing it should be really clear, and we should discuss it if it's not, the spec has roughly been, and now we're going to confirm that it's always been, it's about program. It's about you're certifying a program. And what we're trying to discuss here is, now, what's the scope of my program? Can I make it so it only applies to a product line? Where another company might say, well, I'm going to apply it to the whole organization, this, a program. So you certify the program, and then you say, oh, some choose the whole organization to follow that program, and some will say, well, we're only having one product line follow that program, and that's a choice you get.
Well, I understand that, but this is questionable what you're saying in the spec. Is the issue that the spec is actually not prescribing this?
Yes, we don't make any, we don't provide any clarity on the actual scope of the program
Okay.
in the spec today.
So what would we change in the spec in order to align with the 2 points? Then?
We'd probably put a requirement in that says you must describe your scope, define it as part of your evidence, and then you basically, you document that, what scope you're going to use. You have to make that as part of your conformance.
If I could just add a note on that and come back to this thing where organizations would have publicly announced OpenChain conformant program. And with this change, they'd have to say, what is that? So for example, a company which has got some software and a lot of hardware, Toyota comes to mind, their program will be restricted to probably the IVI at the moment, as opposed to the bodywork. So,
in a more another example, in the ISO world, we have a Linux. Our Linux is ISO 9001 certified, but we have other products that are not, and we will use that logo in conjunction with that product. And that spec required us to make that clear what the scope was. If you wanted to
required the org.
Yeah, required the organization to define it in their audit process. There you have an auditor though.
And in many ways, this would reduce the sub-question we've had in the project about, okay, so it's a program, what's the program, what's covered? Well, this would immediately lock that down.
It would give people flexibility to control the level of granularity of it.
So I think we're trying to, in the interest of time, I think we're trying to bring this to a decision.
Right.
I haven't heard any objections to this characterization and this approach. Is there need for more perspective on that?
All right, to the vote. Shall we proceed with the organization scope as learned from ISO 9001, 2015? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Not in favor, say nay. Any abstain? Okay, we pass with no abstain, no nay. Fantastic. Last item, housekeeping. Sprinkled around our projects are multiple ways of saying open source. So we say open source, we say FOSS, and so on. In practice in the market, what we're getting is that everyone says open source. And where we have things that say FOSS, we often have to explain what that means. So as a housekeeping item, essentially the proposal is that we go through our documentation and make sure everything says open source. And in that way, we're fully consistent. Does anyone have any objection to us proceeding in this manner? So to the vote, all in favor of essentially harmonizing our terminology and using open source, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone against the harmonization towards the use of term open source? Any abstain? All right, we pass. That's actually it for the first steering committee. So to recap, we have 3 votes undertaken. One vote was to undertake the training approach that Mark had outlined based on standardization. with adjacent work on our roles and responsibility. It passes by majority with nay from Sammy and Miriam. We will proceed to explore that. The recommendation of the steering committee is we go and explore that. Second, organization scope. We adopt pretty much direct off ISO 9001. All in favor, no objections. We proceed in that manner. Third item, the use of the term open source. We will harmonize across our documentation. All in favor, no nay. So in this case, we've got 3 recommendations from the steering committee. None of them are irreversible. The one that'll be happening in the very near term is the terminology, because that's the easiest win. And we'll be exploring the training and the organization thing. Recommendations are taken. We will pass those to the governing board. Thank you very much. Meeting is closed.